one of the big issues, for some of us, it wasn't the issue, but for people with, I suspect, school-aged children during the election campaign was education. We know, in fact, it's ironic in actual fact, I was just looking a couple of nights ago at NCA results for boys and noting the dramatic drop from 2020 to 2022. They've just been published for 2022, obviously, from last year's ones, and noticing throughout the country the dramatic drop in NCA passes at levels 1, 2 and 3 for boys, which obviously I would assume is COVID related, but it is dramatic. And we know also that New Zealand's international rankings have been declining since before, to be fair, the advent of this government, but they have got worse subsequently. In the coalition agreements with both National and with New Zealand First, education got a mention, but perhaps not as much of a mention as you might have thought, given what seemed to be the intractable problems in that sector. And also in yesterday's 100-day action plan, there really weren't an awful lot of issues to do with education. To give us her overview over this, and I value her independent and academic advice, I will invite Dr. Nina Hood from the Education Club onto the program with us. Nina, good morning to you. Welcome.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Listen, you've had a look at, I assume, both of the coalition agreements, and you probably would have just had a quick glance yesterday at whether or not education is going to be in the 49 100-day actions that this government will take. Education doesn't appear to have a big thrust, does it?
Not as much as one might hope. So by my reading, there are about 3 of the 49 actions from yesterday relate to at least school-level education. And there are a couple of hints of what might be to come in the coalition agreements, but not a lot more at this stage, although one might hope that as we get further on in this government, there might be a little bit more attention put on to education.
Do you think that's because Erica Stanford, the new Minister of Education, will take her time because she's that sort of person? Or do you think it's because already there is a perception that the Education Ministry have taken her over?
Look, I couldn't talk to the latter point of that. I mean, I wouldn't be able to say that they have done that. I think the new minister will be taking her time to figure out exactly how she wants to make her move in the education space. My understanding from how she's previously spoken is that she has a real interest and passion for education and has some really clear ideas about things that she wants to change and wants to address. And I think we are seeing some of those come through in the announcements so far. So clearly there's a real focus on making sure that we get our teaching of literacy, English and maths really strong, particularly at that primary and intermediate level. And, you know, just doing that is going to be a massive step forward for New Zealand, and it's going to take time as well.
Yeah, well, I mean, just on that curriculum issue, one of the things we talked about, obviously, I think a number of people did in the lead up to the election was, for example, the science curriculum. Yesterday, the government said there's a whole series of things we need you to stop working on. That wasn't one of them. As you would have just alluded to, bullet points 37, 38 and 39 require primary and intermediate schools to teach an hour of reading, writing and maths per day starting in 2024. I guess that's quite a big one, isn't it? Ban the use of cell phones in schools, although if that's in classes or the whole school day, I don't know, and appoint an expert group to redesign the English and maths curriculum for primary school students. I guess to do those things, they don't need to change the law, do they? Is that just a directive that goes to the Ministry of Education and to schools?
I would have thought so. So, I mean, the hour of reading, writing and maths per day, look, I think for starters, some schools are already doing that, which is fantastic.
Yeah.
And I think it will be a directive and an encouragement for schools to do that. I mean, how you enforce that is going to be a really challenging thing to do. But I think from my point of view, what that signals, and it signals hopefully to schools and teachers, is that these subjects are foundational to a child's success at school. So thinking really carefully about how they are structured within a school day, across a school week, is really important. And it's also something that is relatively quick and easy to implement. Although what I'd also argue is that without also, improving pedagogy and improving the curriculum, just mandating the amount of time that subjects get taught is not in and of itself actually going to change.
And that's the issue.
So there are other things that
right.
need to sit alongside.
Yeah,
that.
and that's the big issue, isn't it? That it's not it's not what it is what teachers teach, but it is how they teach that you've concentrated upon, and is a key issue.
Absolutely. And so we know that you've got to get the pedagogy and the curriculum working together. And if we look at point 39, they're obviously thinking about how they can address the curriculum. So, and focusing first on the English and maths curriculum, and obviously we had drafts of those come out earlier in the year, but it would seem that there's a desire to make some relatively quick changes to those drafts. And I would imagine that that's going to be putting a lot more detail and specificity in there about exactly what it is that children should be learning at different stages of their schooling journey. I think the next step after that will be thinking about, okay, so if we've got the time being spent in school, if we know what teachers are meant to be focusing on during that time, how is it that they're meant to be actually teaching? And that's going to take I think we've got the foundations of what that might look like, but it's obviously going to take time to be upskilling teachers in how to do that. And so that also requires changes to what happens in initial teacher education, and it requires changes to what happens in professional development.
The expert group is going to be the key there, and that's where the politics and the ideology gets played. There was a curriculum group which seemed to have a very, shall we say, liberal ideology that drove many of its deliberations. I've seen that in the curriculum working parties that the Ministry of Education has appointed. Would you expect there to be changes in the kinds of people that Erica Stanford would appoint to those roles now?
I think it's likely that we're going to see some changes. We may see some continuity and some people carried through. But yes, I mean, the fact that the National Party is not satisfied, the Minister's not satisfied with what's being produced to date, would suggest that there has to be some degree of change in the people who are part of that group. Otherwise, presumably, we're going to get a replication of what's already been done.
Yeah.
So, look, reading between the lines, I'd say absolutely we're going to see some changes to the people who are part of that group.
There's already been some pushback from teachers. I've seen a couple of principals quoted in the media, and to be fair, I don't know if that's representative or it's just sort of media mischief, who are arguing that they don't need primary and intermediate schools to teach an hour of reading, writing and maths per day because they pick it up in other subjects, inquiry subjects and things like that. You obviously don't believe that that will be sufficient or has been sufficient?
I think in many school contexts that hasn't been specific, but I think actually we need to take a far more nuanced view to it, right? So the first is that there are some absolutely fundamental skills across reading, writing and maths that we need to make sure that we are explicitly teaching our children. And they change as students progress up through primary school. And so making sure that we have a dedicated focus on those each day is really important. But that's not to say that students aren't also, and we'd absolutely want them to be doing reading and writing and some aspects of maths in social studies, in history, in science. So I think for me, when I think about that hour, I don't necessarily think that it always has to be, 1 hour of reading, go, you do it all at once. It could be, let's do 45 minutes of really intensive focus on reading, breaking it down into some of the different skills, but then also think about how we can be doing reading throughout the day. So that might be the teacher reading a story to children. It might be reading a text as part of the history curriculum. So I think there are different ways that we can be approaching it. But I do think that if we look at the research evidence, it does suggest that having a consolidated period of explicit teaching every day to build up the core fundamental skills that are part of reading, writing and maths is critically important.
Can I ask you, Nina, did you have any discussions with Erica Stanford over the last 3 years and as she put together her thoughts and her policies?
I have had several conversations with her, yes.
Do you think that potentially you could be in that expert group to redesign the English and maths curriculums?
I don't know, and I don't know if I should be, Michael, because I'm not sure that I have all the necessary expertise in English or in maths to be able to do that. I was a social sciences teacher, so that's my sort of curriculum area of expertise. And whilst I have a pretty good generalist understanding of the research on lots of topics in education, and I have some degree of knowledge about English and maths, I don't know that I'd call myself an expert. So I'm not sure that I'd necessarily be the right person to be part of that.
But what is an expert? I mean, I'm watching, for example, so-called experts who have been advising the government at the moment. I'm looking at their backgrounds and particularly their research specialties, and they clearly have an ideological perspective that defines to a large extent their expert status. What is an expert when it comes to designing how kids read and write? And surely there's enough international research available to us and enough research available in this country just from experienced English and maths teachers to be able to drive curriculum that is sensible, isn't there?